Welcome those of you who are joining us. We're just going to wait for a few more minutes to see if a few more people join us as people are navigating breakout rooms.
How many people do we have down, Peggy?
Well, we lost a couple after I said that.
Oh, you're fired. You're fired. So here, I'll tell a quick joke.
Okay, tell a joke.
Hopefully, we'll thank some people. They'll stay. So this is actually one of my patients told me. When does a joke become a dad joke?
I have no idea.
It becomes apparent. Sorry, sorry. I know. Now more people are going to leave.
Oh my gosh, they're dropping like flies. Tell another one. No. Teasing. We're up to 20 folks.
Can they clap on the Connects Me thing? Is there like a thumbs up?
Yeah, somebody just did. Yay.
Nice. So more jokes.
You got 5 likes on that one, Matt.
Right,
go with it.
Right.
You got one more joke?
Better. This is like my standby, my go-to joke. It's my 5-year-old's favorite joke. It's rated G, so don't panic. Peggy knows this one. She's like, not again.
Again, you said you had new jokes. What's up with that?
I had one. Come on. So here it is. What's brown and sticky? A stick.
A stick.
Yeah. I know.
Good.
We'll be here for the next hour. Hour and a half? What are we doing?
Hour and a half.
Oh boy. Okay. All right.
Thankfully for everybody, you only got the first 45 minutes.
Right. And at some point, I'll actually have to talk about something meaningful. So you cut me off there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway.
Any thumbs up on that one?
And no, you didn't get any thumbs
up.
We got two claps.
Okay, here. All right. So here's my last one, and then I think we'll probably get started. It's a drug joke, so I apologize in advance. How do fish get high?
No idea.
On seaweed. Huh? Okay.
Nice.
All right.
Nice. I'm gonna get you a bad dad joke book for next time we present.
Yes. My kids just roll their eyes and leave the room now.
As they should. You should. That should be your cue.
Yep.
All right.
I'm doing a good job.
With that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're right around 26 participants, and we'll see if a few more figured out the breakout rooms on their way. I'm Peggy Reystrom. I'm the Executive Director for the Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska. You're going to hear from me later, but I'm going to let Matt introduce himself, and he's going to take it from here.
So I'm Matthew Garlinghouse. People always sort of, it's sort of funny because I always go by Matt. But if you hear of a Dr. Garlinghouse, who's a neuropsychologist at University of Nebraska Medical Center, that would also be me. And I've had people go, I know a Matt guy, but I know a Dr. Garlinghouse guy. So I am both of those people. And I always have people call me Matt because my last name is so long. And as I mentioned, I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. I got my PhD at the University of North Dakota in clinical psych and did my internship and fellowship at Dartmouth Medical School, which is now the Geisel School of Medicine, in neuropsychology and neuroimaging. And as a consequence of being a full nerd, I talk about the brain structure, brain function, brain development, and this makes Peggy and I a good pair because I talk about the development and she talks about how things go wrong, and so we spend a fair amount of time visiting with folks about juvenile justice, intimate partner violence, and brain injury. And so this is one of those talks that we're doing. So I'll talk for the first 45 minutes. Is that right, Peggy? Give or take a little bit?
I should tell you 35 minutes because you run long, and we've now taken 7 minutes.
All right. So if I stop at 2:40.
That would be safe.
Okay, so I'll stop at 2:40, and then we'll have time.
And I'm going to mute myself and hide myself until it's my turn. So they just get to look at your beautiful
wave me off if I'm in the middle of something and lose track of time, because that never happens.
Okay.
You know,
And
yeah.
I'm also gonna kind of be monitoring the chat, and I'll hop on every now and then with that.
Yeah, so yeah, if there are questions, I'm used to presenting to physicians. So normally after about the first 3 or 4 minutes, people are on their cell phones and fake getting paged out of the room. So my point being, feel free to ask questions in the middle of the talk. I would be more than happy to answer what I can. Peggy certainly will have some answers, and then she and I will switch, and she will talk, and I'll try to answer questions during the second half of the presentation. So now I will stop the video, say goodbye to the island. I will share my screen. And I will also remember to turn on my pointer this time. Ta-da! Because last time I had this great slides and I forgot to turn my pointer so nobody could see my pointer. So you'll notice I do tend to use humor as a means to communicate. I don't want that to be confused for a lack of seriousness or interest in the presentation or the material, which is relatively serious. I just feel that people learn better when the information is shared in a polite and somewhat humorous way at times. So please don't confuse those two. I am pleased to be here. One of the things that we'll talk about today is the maturational changes in the human brain as we progress from, essentially being a tadpole to being a full-on human being. I would like for folks in that context to understand the consequences of disruptions in that maturational process that occur either as a consequence of injury or neglect or all of the above. I think I will leave this mostly for Peggy. Depends on how much time we have, but regardless, there will be an opportunity to talk about strategies to manage some of these symptoms, although that's not particularly a part of this talk. But when I do email my slides to Jenny, I think sometimes these can be just helpful starting points as you think about how to manage the patients or your clients, and reach them and help them to grow and mature from where they are. So unfortunately, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I wish I had a big pharma grant to talk about that would potentially bias all of my findings. I'm working on that. I just don't have one yet. I don't know what I've been doing with my time. Someday I will have a conflict of interest, but not yet. So we're going to start off from the beginning, as I mentioned, to talk about some of the neural substrates, to use really nerdy language, or the stuff that makes us what we are. And just for review, we start out as a sort of a slug, and then we become this sort of a tadpole, and then over time we sort of, resemble a human being. This first part of development happens in 9 months, and you can see here that our organs, our internal organs, some of them form outside of our body here in this moment, and then are folded back in. And so the reason that I share this is not to rehash, well, not solely to rehash human embryology, but to also remind you that the whole concept of human development is about space. We are in here in about as tight a way as we can be, and not to be too indelicate, but as a very good friend of mine put it, watching childbirth is like seeing your best friend get hit by a semi. And I bring that up as an introduction to saying this part of the human anatomy here and here is about as big as it can be to be brought into the world in this moment. As a species, we are about as big as we possibly can be. And so part of the majority of early development is about working in the space that exists. And there are things that can disrupt those moments at very fragile times, either pre-birth or post-birth, doesn't matter. And we'll kind of talk about that process. So here is just sort of a cartoon representation of this developmental trajectory here. And the important thing to note is essentially your central nervous system starts out as a funny shaped straw and then begins to fold in on itself and fold in on itself and fold in on itself until here at the end of about 28 weeks gestation, we have the beginnings of a brain. But you can see here, even at 25 weeks, things are very smooth on the surface. We just begin to get enfolding as we approach 28 weeks, and certainly at 36 to 40 weeks when we give birth. This is progressing, and it continues to progress for many, many years. So just a quick check. Here's a pop quiz. At what age does our brain stop developing? Give or take a little bit. And for those of you who are women, you already know that your brains develop faster than men's brains do, because you're smarter and you're built better genetically. True story, true story. So in that process, then you can see here that these are major neural pathways and the ventricular system, because you remember the brain has to float, so it has the ventricles are these funny shaped balloons, if you will, that are essentially fluid filled sacs in your brain, which keep it from collapsing in on itself because it's very fragile. I got 29 minutes, Peggy, I got you. So here's the answer after the question I just asked. When does the human brain really finally stop maturing? Well, the answer is 20 years, give or take a little bit. More for men, less for women. And here's why. So as I showed on the prior slide, we have neurogenesis, we have immune system, we have glial genesis, we have synaptogenesis, we have myelination, we have synaptic pruning. So that's a fancy way of saying here from conception to 5+10 years of age, we're growing things. And then the brain shifts gears and it refines what it has into the final adult version of itself at about age 20. And the reason it takes so long, as you can see here in the mouse brain, there are just a couple of layers, whereas in the human brain, there are many, many layers. And so as we're growing, just in the weeks post-conception and pre-birth, and certainly in the years after birth, we are building layers and layers of different cells in the brain. And so there are these radial cells that sort of span out as a mesh or a network. Then there are these migrating cells that move along the network to form strata, if you will, or layers in the computers of the brain that are along the surface of the brain. And, you know, there's 100 and some odd billion cells in the brain that sort of have to get plus or minus where they need to be. And so while no human brain is exactly the same, in general, for the most part, the abilities that these neural networks subserve or are responsible for, so for example, language, for the most part, it's, you know, on the left side of your brain, and this part that's kind of above your ears that migrates forward to a part that's sort of above your eyes, not directly above, but sort of off to the side there. And while, you know, this has to happen 100 billion times, for the most part, it's a pretty well-run system. Now, one of the things that's finalizing here at the end, this is myelination. And so here through experience, as we migrate from about age 5 through age 20, the experience that we have, whether it's academic or familial or social, shapes the ultimate function of our brain. It shapes what in essence, what it's keyed for, to look for, how it functions in general within some broad parameters. And then here we have this myelination, which sort of solidifies all of that stuff. And this is sort of the wiring in the brain, and the myelin in the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, is created by these oligodendrocytes here. And you can see here it's just insulation on these long pathways in the brain that communicate from cell body to cell body, if you will. So this is the communication pathway, and then the cell body send out axons that grow from cell body to cell body. And we're electrical, right? These have currents, so they bring in various ions, potassium or sodium, and they kick out certain ions. And the cells, these tubes become charged, and they send along a signal, right? An electrical signal. And the point of the myelin is that it makes the signal about 100 times faster, give or take a little bit, but for the purposes of this talk, than they would be if these little things weren't here. And so things that disrupt myelination during development can be a problem, and that can be injury, that can be neglect, that can be diet, that can be genetic disorders, or all of these things put together. Sometimes it's little things, environmental events that can go a long way to changing how the system works if it occurs at a really important developmental stage. Okay, so again here, we insulate the myelin as a species because we need more speed. Just like my teenager is always yelling at me to get faster internet so he can game more with his friends when my spouse is online trying to work. And again, you can see here that if we did not have this myelin sheath, which wraps around the axon here, the cell pathway, the connection speed is much slower. But because we have these things, it goes from 10 meters a second to about 120 meters a second, and as is cited continuously in the literature, it's an essential part of how our nervous system functions optimally. And oh, look, so here's kind of what our nervous system looks like. So at a microscopic level, you can see here that we have these cell bodies on the surface here, and that we have these long axons projecting down into the folds. And why are there folds? Well, because our brain ran out of space, so it has to fold in on itself to get all of the stuff done that it needs to get done. And so this is just a little snapshot of a couple of different cells and how this all puts together in what is tissue that is grown in a petri dish. But the cells are pre-programmed, right? They know what to do. If you put these in a petri dish, they will grow this way automatically. It's beautiful. And here's even a more refined view. So you can see here we have the cell bodies, these axons that are growing out. They're networking here with axons from other cell bodies. And so some of these connections you can see run this way in the cortex, some run up and down, some leave the cortex and project all the way down to your big toe, for example. And it's this highly intricate system. And as I mentioned, if you interrupt it at certain times, you don't end up with this, which is this beautiful slice of this is like a side slice of a human brain. And you can see here, these are the layers I was just talking about with the cell bodies. And these are these long pathways that network down here into these varying commissures, or this is the caudate here, for example, and as they pass down into the cerebellum here, and then out back back to the cortex, or down through the pons and the medulla into the body. You can see here that there's ganglia in these various regions, little bundles of nerves that sort of work as a mini brain doing things. Remarkably intricate, remarkably. And as I mentioned, this process is shaped by experience. So the brain is plastic. It has some pre-programming written into it, but the code is altered in many ways depending on what we experience as a child, an adolescent, and even a young adult. And so one of the things that we notice with developing children is that if they're a victim of any type of abuse, the brain structure will look different Similarly, in adolescent, for those that have experienced abuse, neglect, or have began to use substances at about age 16 seems to be a cutoff for risk for some substances, but not all. Certainly use of substances is bad from a brain perspective at any age, but at or about age 16 seems to be a time when it alters not only thinking ability in many ways, but also the how the brain looks. And so if you do research where you're putting people in their 20s who began using, say, cannabis, for example, or Molly at age 15 or 16 and had continued using it pretty steadily for at least a year or two, and you do the imaging on their brain and you do the imaging on people who haven't used drugs, their brains look different. Now, at an individual level, you may not be able to see it, but at a group level, the changes are quite noticeable, and they're correlated with problems in thinking, memory, problem solving at times. And so what's happening here is as this pruning occurs beginning at about age 14, the use of substances affects how many dendrites and axons are being produced, because you're overstimulating an area with the drugs that shouldn't be overstimulated. And so the profile begins to look more disorganized like this and less organized like this, even though they're maturing into their late teenage years. So we have this incredibly complex, and it's this beautiful system. It's set up to prepare us for adulthood. It's set up so that whether I grew up in Alaska, whether I grew up in Africa, or whether I grew up fishing, or whether I grew up hunting, or whether I need to know how to start fires, whether I need to know how to shoot a bow and arrow, or whether I need to understand how to order stuff on Amazon, that the brain over time becomes best suited to complete those behaviors that I am doing routinely while I'm growing up. So if I'm hiding in my bedroom while I'm growing up because I'm afraid my father is going to come home and hit me, abuse me, then my brain becomes really sensitive for things that signal danger in the environment, and it becomes less in tune to learn and focus on other kinds of behavior, social relationships, for example. Conversely, if I grow up in a home where I'm supported and I have some freedoms, and I'm fairly successful at school. My goodness, I'm sorry. It's been a long week. I can't talk anymore. Then my brain is more tuned in to learn and to be academically successful, and it's less in tune for those things that shape danger in the environment. So that you get kids who are street smart and kids who are book smart. Well, there's sort of a reason for that, right? So we're shapeable. We are being fine-tuned to be successful because our body sort of assumes that the environment we grew up in, interestingly, is the environment that we're going to spend the majority of our lives in. And that may have some direct impact on why it is so hard to change patterns of substance use and abuse in families. The brain is sort of wiring itself as we grow to be in those environments. So it's sort of an interesting catch-22 in some ways. If your environment works for you, you're set up to be successful. If your environment doesn't work for you, you may in fact be being set up to not be as successful. And part of the reason for that is sort of like my 14-year-old son, it just never really stops talking, right? So they have these highly specialized regions. I mentioned earlier that language has a particular region, and this is language and maybe sensory function, and this is sort of overall synthesis of information coming into the left hemisphere. And you don't have to remember all these things. This is the cingulate involved in motivation and behavior. This is the frontal lobe, which goes along with the left, the mid, and then the right. So these are regions you can see here where there's a lot of crosstalk, and that's involved in personality and judgment and planning, things that really, really, truly emerge, as people sort of approach 20, which is why my 14-year-old will not be driving next year, because I've seen him play GTA and oh my goodness. Okay, so at any rate, just be mindful that there's a ton of these networks, a ton of them, and that they all are involved in executing purposeful behavior. And so the old adage, we only use 10% of our brain, structurally and functionally, while it's an interesting metaphor, it isn't correct. So the brain is highly specialized, and if you disrupt some of these centers, you're going to have changes in how all of these networks work together. And so I'll just talk about that briefly here. How am I doing for time? Oh, I got 15 minutes left. I should be all right. So we sort of condense all of these things down here into about 6 major functional brain networks, even though here I've got like 15 or 20 or something. Really, people talk about default mode, a salience network, a ventral attention, a dorsal attention, and then some other sort of more executive networks when they talk about large scale brain networks. But the point is, all of these little computers here in the brain that are the same color, these are mostly all in the cortex, even though it's hard to tell. The cortex can extend down in some cases to the area. Here, here's kind of a good example. So you can think of the main pathway between the 2 hemispheres, the superhighways, the corpus callosum, and it's here. And then above that is the anterior cingulate and then more cortex. And so you can see here that there's some space because the corpus callosum is here, and then beneath that is the ventricle, again, that water-filled sac. So you can see how there's sort of a tendency for a lot of these computers to be nearer the surface, and that's why. Not all of them are, but that's why. So, for example, all of these red regions here tend to be active at the same time. So all of these red regions are sort of talking to each other in that same moment. And this is sort of this default mode network, or what the brain does in its spare time, if you will, when nothing else is really happening. And that helps, interestingly, regulate the milieu, if you will, between some of the other brain networks. And so here, as I talked about, there's the Salience Network, and so there are some darker regions here where the brain is sort of, this is the network that kicks in, when you're sitting at your desk. And I'll give an example. My office is down here on Farnham, right by the ER at the hospital. And so when I first moved in, my Salience Network kicked in every time some sirens would rush past outside my window, and I'd look out. And then, because it was happening 20 times a day, my Salience Network said, whatever, forget about it. So I did. And now when they come by, I don't even think about it. And my patients go, wow, did you see that? I'm like, whatever. Then they moved the helicopter landing pad over to where I could see it. And, oh, that was cool. And now it's like, whatever. So again, things in environment here. So this is sort of the regulator. And then things, there are regions of the brain that go, oh, is that relevant? Is that important? Is that siren relevant? Did somebody slam the door real loud? Oh no, is dad home? These are things that begin to network with other regions that affect attention, what we attend to. And so in the middle of algebra, if I've got a friend, and some of you maybe heard me talk about my friend John, and that's not his real name, and I have permission to talk about John, but John experienced domestic violence when he was growing up, and he never did really well in school because this part of his brain was always wondering and thinking about, ooh, what was that noise? And so, this dorsal attention network here, if you will, and this sort of pine green, lovely pine green, was not focused, in fact, on how to graph a function and what y equals mx plus b really means. It was worried about what was going to happen when he got home and how was he going to protect his mom. And to this day, John has some difficulties learning because he had an fMRI study that was sort of explained to him that his brain continues to be hardwired really to look for danger in the environment, even when there isn't danger. And because it's doing that, when he learns, it's a divided attention process. He has great difficulty focusing on one thing at a time. In fact, even when he's at a restaurant, he never sits with his back to the door. to the point where when the group of us get together, we quick get into the restaurant and take seats. So he has to sit with his back to the door. He will actually move his chair. Really, really concerned for things that signal danger in the environment. And this slide I like because it highlights why there's this U-shaped curve for teens and accidents. So if you graph it here, the number of accidents up here, time over here, teenagers are crashing. They get into their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then the U goes back up as our processing speed slows down, and our attentional focus waxes and wanes as we mature into our 70s and 80s, and then we start to crash again. And so what's happening literally is that this what we call the cool kids call the DLPFC, which is this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is refined really up through age 20, at which point your brain says, hey, you're an adult, go forth, do good things. But at age 15, it doesn't do quite as well. And there's biological reasons for that. So if I get hit, either playing football, or by a parent, or because I'm being bullied routinely, at some of these real key moments, some of these, and depending on the extent of the injury, some of these things don't form as well. And so if you have an injury here as a preteen, maybe you were heading the soccer ball too much, or you're really, really big for a 14-year-old, and the varsity football coach says, hey, I need a tackling dummy for the varsity defensive line. Come over here. And they just spend an hour tackling you. You can literally have structural damage here to the surface of the computers, or to some of this wiring. And the consequence is that as you mature, this never really becomes refined. So yes, as a species, you can have a shot here. I remember my 2-year-old, I was down talking to the neighbor, and my wife was watching him. And she turned to look at me real quick, and he took a header off the top step and fell down 3 steps onto our concrete patio, and didn't move initially. And I thought for sure that was what I call an IQ changing hit. Now, thankfully, the brain is resilient, but if you have enough of those, that can be a problem. Or through neglect, if you have malnutrition. Literally, if you're not hugged, there are a host of things that come together to allow the brain to function, and that there are things that the brain counts on. So one of them is nutrition, one of them is intellectual stimulation. In other words, there's a difference between children who are left alone, who are neglected and don't go to school for whatever reason, versus children who do go to school, right? Their brains look different. Similarly, I heard of a story about a 9-month-old who had been fed on sugar water for 6 months. As you might imagine, when they did the CAT scan of that infant's brain, it didn't look as one would expect. And there are relative, really important times when the brain never catches up in this progression. And so you can reach age 20 and not have had the ability to have this, I call it cooked, to have this really, really finished, maturing. And as a species, even for me, people know me as being sort of a frontal guy, right? There is variability in here, and then you add injury on top of that, or psychiatric illness. And psychiatric illness, you'll note, emerges for most people. If you look at the major, what used to be considered the sort of persistent and severe behavioral health concerns, these emerge really between age 18 to 22 in our species. And as people mature, for example, when I was at Dartmouth, I saw and evaluated for research purposes a lot of patients that were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And about 80% of the time, just by looking at their MRI scan, you could kind of identify whether they were a healthy control or a patient, right? These are neurodevelopmental disorders in some ways. And again, that they affect this final outcome.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
This is Peggy. Just a quick question came online. how do we help people rewire their brains to work better for them?
Oh, see, that's a great talk. I have that talk.
I was going to say that's a whole nother hour for you.
Or more. I will say it is possible. We have to meet people where they are, and you have to work with them. And it's not necessarily complete, again, depending on the nature of the illness or the injury. But there is good evidence that these networks here, following injury or neglect or the onset of psychiatric illness, can become hijacked, and that medications or exercise or cognitive rehab can at times reduce this overall effect. Interestingly, really a combination of all three is best. And as these cells become less active, the overall network becomes more functional. And this may actually be the pathway through which both psychiatric and cognitive rehab occur. And so, yes, there are definite strategies, things you can do to help work with it. And as the science, we're just sort of getting an understanding of, for depression, there may be nodes here that are more problematic. For anxiety, there may be nodes more here in the frontal lobe that may be more problematic. For patients that have had, moderate traumatic brain injury where there's structural changes, structural damage, you may be able to do tasks that are, let's say the damage happened here. You may be able to do tasks that work in areas around where the injury occurred to help encourage as much cortical differentiation as you can, so that these abilities kind of spread out. And I'll get to what I mean here in just a minute. So here we apply this force. Because the brain floats, it bounces. Peggy has a great illustration for this, so I won't get into it too much. But the problem with too much bouncing in the brain is that it causes tissue damage, as highlighted by the blood here. The brain tends to be damaged in areas of the skull that are designed to keep it safe. And at some level, these are really, really essential. So you can see here, these are bony ruts, if you will. And the brain is sort of nestled in that like a comfortable blanket, which is great until there's too much force applied. And then you can see here it causes injury in these areas where the brain is resting. And so as the brain bounces off, these fossa, then you're more likely to have injury in these areas. And that's a problem because as a species, this is where memory and language is, as well as planning and personality and inhibition and initiation, and things that are relevant for maintaining housing, things that are relevant for filling out paperwork, things that are relevant for maintaining a job, things that are relevant for maintaining social comportment, how we behave towards others, right? I took my kids to Lincoln, and we got off, we parked in we went to the Children's Museum. This was probably 2 years ago now. Well, maybe 3. And we parked in the garage. We got out, and we're walking to the elevator in that parking garage that's sort of down the hall from the Noodles and down the street from the Noodles and Company. And we're walking to the elevator, and this gentleman walks up to try to join us in the elevator, and he's got no pants essentially, and a long shirt on it. Which when I said, "Hold on, sir, we'll send the elevator back up for you," and so he stopped. He didn't make eye contact with me. He didn't talk. He just sort of stood at the door while the door closed. And thankfully, he didn't try to get on the elevator because, I don't know, in that moment, it just seemed like there was some risk there, like things weren't quite right. And so there are times when these disorders can affect how one functions in society. And my sense was it wasn't just that he didn't understand how pants worked. There was probably more going on there, right? So these things come together. Where juvenile justice issues, does one have the ability to function well in school? How am I doing? Okay, I got 1 minute, Peggy. All right. And here's another example. So this is the brain of Phineas Gage. This is his CT of his skull, and you may remember Phineas Gage. Wait a minute, who was that guy? Well, this was the guy from Psych 101 who was doing the railroad construction in Vermont. When he had that big iron rod shot through his head because the explosive went off when it wasn't supposed to. And so what I really want you to remember is this is another way of representing the large scale brain networks and how all of these regions are working together. You have crosstalk, you have major pathways, you have less major pathways, but the brain is working. And here, this is a representation of what they feel happened after the injury. And you can see here that instead of being, a well-functioning broad network, here there's lots of pieces that aren't working anymore. And the consequence of that, whether again it's from abuse or neglect or psychiatric illness or injury, is that the brain doesn't work as efficiently as it should. And so Peggy will talk about can't do versus won't do problems. And one of the things we're discovering with a lot of folks involved in the juvenile justice system, not all, but a fair amount, is that many of them may have had some disruptions during their development, whether through injury, neglect, or psychiatric illness, that literally may be affecting their underlying cognitive ability. And if that happens, how much is destiny? How much can be fixed? And this is sort of getting back to the question that was asked. How much and how can we fix? And how much and how can't we fix? And so one of the things that happens when the brain is injured, and again, this can be a psychiatric illness model, this can be a abuse and neglect model, is that the brain reaches out to pathways in areas that it shouldn't. And when it does that, it just doesn't work as well. And so, as I mentioned, there are medications and cognitive rehabilitation and strategies to reinforce the fact that this network shouldn't be reaching out here. And there is evidence that there are strategies, things you can do that can make a difference. Doesn't fix it, it can make it a little better. So I think this is my last slide. Okay, good. I'm a little bit late. That's only 2 minutes, Peggy. It's kind of a new record for me, only 2 minutes late.
Yeah, not too bad.
Yeah. So, again, we get one of the things that you'll notice in many of your patients is that they have this concrete thinking. Concrete, what do I mean by that? Somebody asks me the time, I say it's 3:45. They say, no, it's 3:48. As though those two things were different. Because in my world, they're not. But in their world, it may be. And so there are times when you may be working with a patient and you just can't get through with them because they are so concrete. There's absolutely almost no judgment and abstract thought. And so, there are ways when, you have to modify how you interact with patients. I tend to speak colloquially often. And for my patients that have had injury, I have to speak very concretely. Do this at this time. Don't, just set up a couple of times during the day when your alarm goes off. You'll figure it out. Very concrete. Okay. So I have some other slides, which I won't show in this moment, but my hope is that this is a good precursor to Peggy's talk, where she will really get into injury and talking about injury. And you can think about how, depending on when the injury happened, you're disrupting these very relevant developmental milestones. Okay, moving on. I think I'm good. I'll stop sharing, Peggy, yes?
Yeah, that works.
Cool.
And Matt, there's one person that went to look to find your slides, only did not find those. So this is your gentle reminder to share your slides.
With Jenny.
With Jenny, yes.
Excellent, excellent.
And I also need to pull up my presentation, which I thought was going to be easy to find, and it's not, which is making me nervous all of a sudden. You could tell another joke.
All right, I got one more.
Okay.
What did the fish say when it swam into the brick? Damn. Sorry.
Oh, those are great. Okay.
Also, my contact information, you can find me on the UNMC website. I'm the only Garlinghouse at the hospital. Garling house, just like it said on the bulletin. So if you have questions, I'm a big emailer. You can certainly call the office too. Always happy to chat.
All right. And he'll be around for a few more minutes because he's going to have to sit through my presentation.
That's right. Happily.
And maybe he'll even remember to check the chat box and make sure there aren't any questions as I go through. All right, I'm hoping you can all see that. So Matt, great job. Thank you for your words of wisdom there. So Matt kind of shared with you his position. I am, as I mentioned earlier, I'm the executive director for the Brain Injury Alliance. And my background is I'm a social worker by trade. I have spent the last 25 plus years now, getting older every day, in the field of brain injury. And 14 of those years I spent as a social worker at Madonna Rehab Hospital, and had an amazing opportunity there to learn from a lot of great professionals, but also began to really realize that there's not a lot of services for folks as we look to discharge them back out into the community. And we had received some federal funds to actually start the Brain Injury Alliance in 2009. So we've been around for a while, and we're a 501c3 that's just really trying to do a lot more outreach and education about what is brain injury. The objectives that I have, I just really want to cover kind of what is brain injury, why does it matter, and what can we do about it. That's probably the thing that I would love to have our brain injury community, our Nebraska community, have a better understanding of when you see brain injury, what is it that we can do? Not everybody's going to have an opportunity to go see the Matt Garlinghouses of the world for therapy or for consultation or for any help. So we know that they're being served within your area, and what is it that you can do to maybe better support them within your world. And why is this important? There are certain high-risk populations that we see that brain injury is happening more frequently. Had an opportunity last December to go out and do a brain injury screening with about 25 kids at the Youth Detention Center here in Lancaster County. And the numbers were huge. I'll go into more of this in more detail a little bit later, but just to kind of, you are serving these people whether you know it or not. 72% of those I screened out at the detention center that cold December day were screening positive for brain injury. 96% of them were either hit or strangled. 40% of them had 6 or more times in which this happened. 64% didn't get any medical assistance, and 84% endorsed brain injury symptoms. But of course, when I asked the kids, have you had a brain injury? Most of them said no. And yet they indeed did, but it's a matter of how you ask the questions. So again, this is a group you're working with, whether you knew it or not. And I appreciate your participation to learn more. What is brain injury? This is gonna kind of break into the more clinical questions or just definitions. We really look at acquired brain injury, which is anything that happens to our brain after we've been born. So it's then broken into even further definitions. We're looking at non-traumatic and traumatic. Non-traumatic acquired brain injury includes if a person has had a brain tumor, an anoxic injury or a lack of oxygen to their brain, infection for individuals who've maybe had a stroke or an aneurysm, if you've had carbon monoxide poisoning, that all falls under a non-traumatic brain injury. And my guess is almost everybody on this Zoom meeting knows somebody who's maybe had one of those things happen. And the traumatic, which is what we hear about more frequently, is where it's the bump, the blow, the jolt to the head. And this is when we're thinking of football players, when we think of injuries that have happened because of car accidents. And I'm guessing I'm not going to get my little slide, my little picture here to work. Oh, I am. So this is an example of a traumatic brain injury. I know we oftentimes get asked the question, especially in regards to student athletes. Well, they had a helmet on. Certainly that's helping to prevent concussions. You know, there is no such thing as a concussion-proof helmet, folks. There just really isn't. Our brain's still kind of sloshing around doing its jiggle. within our skull when we get hit. Certainly those helmets help prevent skull fractures, but they don't have a strong effect on how much our brain is jiggling around when we get hit hard. I also have added just a slide here about oxygen deprivation and anoxic injury, which is considered that non-traumatic acquired brain injury. A lot of the youth that we were working with, and even some of the work that we've done with domestic violence, we've learned to ask the question about strangulation or choking. And primarily because, as Matt, I think, had alluded to in his presentation, it's just that it's important to have oxygen to our brain and all parts of our brain, because that can start to affect different parts of our brain, and especially sometimes our memory centers. I share a quick little story here. When I was at Madonna, we had an individual who was the victim of a domestic violence, and somebody had actually taken a hammer to her head, and so part of her skull was missing because they had to remove that. And anyway, we were helping her through brain injury rehab, but she was right next to a lady who had a heart attack, who was without oxygen to her brain for quite a while, and I don't think anybody ever really knew how long she went without. As the discharge planner, as the person looking to help people set up services as and supports as they left our facility, knowing they still needed a fair amount of help, I can tell you, as a social worker, I needed to set up a lot more services for the lady with the anoxic injury, the lack of oxygen to her brain because of the heart attack, than I did the lady with the hammer to her head that was a focal injury. It was just one part of her brain. And I share that story because the hammer sounds so much more traumatic than the heart attack. But on the other hand, it's like the results of functioning for the lady with a lack of oxygen to her brain for a longer period of time was really much more significant in what she was going to need help with down the road. So I don't want you to underestimate the strangulation and the choking that's maybe going on with some of the youth that you're working with. We are looking at some of the different effects. So what does brain injury really look like? We're breaking it out into physical, cognitive, and social effects. Some of the physical effects is how are they doing with balance and walking problems? If some folks really struggle with dizziness, and they just kind of look like they're almost drunk when they're walking. Some individuals complain about headaches that just don't go away. And that seems to be the one thing that we hear about probably more than anything, is just, I got this headache that just won't go away. Fatigue, super tired, just don't have the strength or the energy, I should say, to be able to push forward. Some folks complain about sleep disturbance. Maybe it's just that they can't fall asleep. Others are like, I just want to sleep all the time. Others notice that nauseousness and vomiting are a factor for them. And seems like I hear more about the nauseousness and vomiting when it's more recently happened, when the injury has been in more recent time versus it being a long-term effect. Other visual or other physical effects is visual disturbances, where an individual has a hard time kind of seeing where things are in space. And this depends upon where the injury happens, if it affects the occipital lobe or not. But an example would be, one time we had a youth filling out a form, and he was putting all the answers outside the little box that he was supposed to be checking. And obviously he had a visual shift as to where he thought things were in space, and it was because of his brain injury. Sometimes that gets better. For some folks, those visual disturbances really hang on, and it can really throw off how are you doing with driving and returning to work, and how are you doing with schoolwork and filling out forms. Sensitivity to light, bright lights, fluorescent lights can be really hard on students or youth in general after a brain injury. And at one time I walked into a room, we're having a meeting with an individual that had a brain injury. I didn't know she'd had a brain injury, but she's like, we're just gonna leave the lights off in here. Thankfully, we were in a room that had plenty of natural light from the window, but she's like, I've had a brain injury and those bright lights above me just drive me crazy. So light sensitivity is something to be paying attention to. Ringing in the ears, disorders of taste and smell. I know disorders of taste and smell right now, it's like, oh, is that COVID or is it a brain injury? But it is a neurological effect of brain injury. The cognitive effects that we're looking for, this is that attention and those concentration problems, just that ability to stay focused, be able to process information, really highly distracted. Oftentimes, if you have poor attention and concentration, that's going to lead you to poor memory because you haven't had time to really let it sink in. Slowed thinking, feeling kind of foggy. I know if I'm one of those, if I ever take a Benadryl, I might as well just like discount the rest of the day because I get really medicine head with that kind of medication. And so that is sometimes what you hear people kind of describe after a brain injury. Just, I can't quite process information. Somebody tells me something and it takes me a while to think through what they just said, processing it. Learning and memory problems, I already kind of talked about that. Executive functioning problems, that ability to think through, plan ahead, have insight and awareness. Okay, I got to get this done before this. Being able to sequence that and process that information just becomes a little more difficult after a head injury or a brain injury. Social emotional effects, what we're looking at here is just that behavior. It's the mood, it's the why do they acting different? Irritability, short fuse. Some folks just complain, it's like, I just can't tolerate things the way I used to. Anxiety, things make them so much more anxious. We worked with a student one time who he had a traumatic brain injury after a car accident, and he actually had graduated but was looking at going into taking some classes at Southeast Community College, and he was a very gifted student prior to his injury. But his anxiety was so incredibly high that he couldn't sit through a classroom, for the fear that somebody might call on him. But he's just like, that part of his brain was just kicked into high gear, and so many things made him anxious. Sadly, years later, some of the anxiety, the depression, some of the mood swings that was a result of his injury, actually, he committed suicide a few years ago just because he just couldn't deal with that stuff anymore. So it was very real. And to listen to his family talk about him and his personality prior to that injury, it's just like a completely different kid. And amazing how it can literally take a life. Impulsivity. Some folks just don't even understand that that's something that they're dealing with, lack of awareness. Again, it seems like we're seeing frontal lobe injuries, having the ability to kind of process that I'm doing things different or be able to read what others are expecting of you. One time we were working with a young man who he would just talk nonstop. And finally we had to come up with some strategies to give him actually visual verbal cues to have him stop talking. Our strategy was to literally put our hand up, and not to be rude, but it's like he wouldn't stop talking and he didn't realize that he wasn't stopping. He was just going on. So lack of awareness about how others are perceiving you and having that conversation. Some folks have a lack of motivation, lack of inhibition, self-centeredness, aggression, social isolation. And when I think of lack of initiation, folks will sometimes just like, one time when working with a gal that she had helped her parents run their family store. And before her injury, she was able to do a lot of stuff independently and just was kind of starting to take over. After her injury, she's like, would stand in the middle of the aisle going, I don't know what to do. And it wasn't because she was lazy. It's just that she had a hard time sequencing that. And so it looked like she was unmotivated. She didn't care anymore. And it was so not that. It was the injury that was causing that. Social isolation. If people do have that insight, they might recognize that, gosh, I can't keep up like I used to. I feel like I sound stupid. I'm just not able to, be myself around folks. So they tend to socially isolate, which is not a good thing either, because then that can lead to the depression. So with all those symptoms that I just rattled off, not everybody has all of those symptoms after an injury. It might be one or two things from each domain. It might be just one main thing from one domain. It really varies about on where the injury was and how bad the injury was. And what thing you really need to keep in mind is that even though, for example, if somebody might have headaches as one of their symptoms, and they might have, a strong emotional response in another, maybe dizziness in another, if just because one of those domains resolve themselves doesn't mean that the brain injury issues have completely gone away. Again, you have to kind of look at the whole piece. How are they doing as a whole, not just, oh, well, they can go back to class because now their memory is better, but they might still be having light sensitivity. You still need to make accommodations for that. Distribution of severity. Most of, and this is in regards to traumatic brain injuries, the bump, the blow, the jolt to the head. A mild brain injury is also known as a concussion. This may or may not have a person may or may not have a loss of consciousness with a mild injury. And the good news is 80% of those injuries get better. That's the good stuff. But you also need to pay attention that sometimes they may not show up for hours or days. So years ago and still today, we talk about when in doubt, sit them out, especially as it relates to sports injuries, and encouraging coaches and teachers and parents and kids to go, okay, if you suspect that was a hard enough hit, you need to just sit out. But it's not just sit out for 10 minutes and see if you're feeling all right. Literally, we're here to say, sit out for a while. Sit out for, the rest of the game, monitor that, because you may not see any symptoms show up for hours and sometimes days. So being able to relate it back to if symptoms show up, even if it's 2 days later, it's like, oh yeah, there was that hit a couple days ago. It sometimes just takes that long for it to happen. Moderate injuries, where you have a loss of consciousness for 30 minutes to 24 hours, you definitely need emergent care. That pertains to about 10% of folks. The severe injury is about another 10%. And the severe injuries were those that I probably served more at Madonna's. Those come in a comatose state and get better. Some get better, some don't. So the good news and the bad news, and I already kind of alluded to this, the good news is 80%, especially those mild brain injuries, which is the largest percentage, get better in 3 to 4 weeks. The bad news is that you've got that 20% that it might take months, years, and for some, it never gets better. And it's like, dang, let's all hope that we fall in that 80%. Except for those that, there's some studies are showing that if you've had 1 injury, you've had 2 injuries, you've had 3 injuries, you've had up to 6, as some of the kids that I interviewed back in December had, the more injuries you have, it just takes longer and maybe harder to actually recover from. So 1 is too many, 2 is too many. What we're really looking for here is prevention, because it's really the only cure. However, you do have some that do get better. Why do some kids get better? And this falls same to be true for adults too. And why do some take longer to heal? Prolonged recovery, here's just a few list of items that we've seen and throughout research that cause it. If you have any of these things going on in your life prior to your injury, it may take a little bit longer to recover. I'm guessing working with the youth that you do, a lot of them might have 1, 2, or 3 or more of the issues that you see on this list. So an injury, a brain injury on top of these things can take those kids longer. Post-Concussive Syndrome, this is PCS. A lot more research is being done in this area, but this is where, again, those symptoms fail to get better, and they can linger for up to 10 years or even for some a lifetime after an injury. We have an amazing board member. She was a principal at a school in the Omaha area. She hit her head on a cabinet. She was a marathon runner. She was a very successful principal. Hit her head on that stinking cabinet and has, to this date, 6 years later, still problems in memory, concentration, and just fatigue. And for her, it just never got better. She was part of that 20%, but it just lingered. And it's certainly a challenge for her, and she does her best to move forward. But if you're ever looking for a good book to learn more about concussion, she wrote this amazing book. It's called Out of the Rabbit Hole by Sharon Reyers, and I'll just put a plug. Sharon, in my opinion, did a nice job illustrating really well what a concussion can feel like. Brain injury in Nebraska, on average, we have, this is per year, we have this thing called the brain injury registry in our state. And on average, every year we're seeing about 13,600 individuals land on that registry identified as having a traumatic brain injury. This isn't the strokes, the aneurysms and whatnot, but is traumatic. And these are only numbers being captured as part of hospital discharge. I do believe, I know that these numbers are, even though they're huge, they are way lower than they really are, given just the screening that we've been doing with the high-risk population, the youth. You know, the 64% of them never went to the hospital. At 64% aren't getting identified on our brain injury registry. So brain injury does happen around us, whether we know it or not. The majority of traumatic brain injuries, according to the CDC, are going to be because of falls and motor vehicle accidents. The population you're serving, the majority are going to be because of assaults and fights. And I'll share a few more of those stats. Some interesting comparisons, why I feel passionate that you all need to know about this. And I think, you know, brain injury is happening around us. I think this is a really interesting slide when we're looking at what is the annual incidence of brain injury, traumatic brain injury, compared to breast cancer. And we are just coming off a month of breast cancer awareness, where I guarantee you somewhere along the way you were asked to donate to Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which again, great, and we should all donate, and I support that. But when I look at that compared to traumatic brain injury and how a lot of folks just don't know about brain injury, I think we within our brain injury community have a lot of work ahead of us. So just a few stats about the crossover between juvenile justice and head injury. There's an interesting article back in 2017 found out adolescents with traumatic brain injury commit more criminal offenses than those without it, and they're oftentimes more likely to have moderate to even severe injury. So even though these numbers are fairly high, the majority of folks, and my guess is within your world, you're not necessarily asking the question, so it's going undiagnosed, unrecognized, and certainly untreated. And to this day, you know, to see juvenile justice programs actually providing any specialized treatment for brain injury, I have not ran into any. Certainly love to see us reach that point where we're doing a better job with that. But when you look at the numbers, and again, people aren't asking the questions, we got some work ahead of us. Why is it oftentimes not identified? It's invisible. It's the invisible injury. They go unnoticed. If we do recognize it, it's like, well, what do we do with it? And so there's not always a lot of great follow-up. We oftentimes think, is it maybe it's mental health, maybe it's things going on at home, is it substance use? And it could be some of those, but again, we're not asking about brain injury within those settings. And our school personnel are certainly not adequately trained to identify or assess that. We have been doing some work in that area, trying to get teachers on board with being able to figure out how they can make accommodations for students after they have been identified as having a concussion. And we did a survey back in 2018 where 50% of teachers are like, I don't even know what I'm looking for. So not sure what to do with that, you know. So again, we're trying to get some information to them. Psychiatric disorder, I think we have a lot of folks that have, you know, again, it's messy. Is it brain injury or is it psychiatric disorders? Certainly some research has been done, you know, looking at the intersection of that. Here within just Nebraska, some work that we're doing right now with the Mental Health Association of Nebraska, which is a peer-driven program that serves folks within the Lincoln community with mental health illness. They were gracious and let me do some screening with their staff, and their staff screened 77% positive for brain injury. That's right, 77% of those identified as having mental health illness screened positive for brain injury. When we went in and talked with them, they're like, yeah, never thought of this, never even crossed my mind. And their numbers were pretty similar to what we found within the juvenile justice in the matter of, how many of them were injured because of assaults and fights, strangulation, the number that didn't go to the hospital. The symptoms were all very similar. Let's skip this slide because I gotta keep on going here. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you. So what are the benefits and recognition, benefits of recognition? And Matt had kind of alluded to it, that I would be chatting about the won't versus the can't. And it really, I think, is important to be able to recognize that what do we have going on with these students. Is it truly that they can't do something, or is it that they won't do something? Thinking sometimes, especially within the criminal justice system, we think that they're not trying hard, they're missing appointments, they look like they don't care, it looks like a behavior problem. And really what we're here to say is, like, if you look at those symptoms, it's not usually a behavior problem, it's just that they simply can't. Here's an example of one time we'd gotten a call from a mom whose son had had a tumor removed at a really young age, I want to say like 18 months. Neurosurgeons were very pleased that they got the tumor, sent him on his way, sent him home, and were pleased with they got the tumor, but there was no discussion about what's that going to look like, where that tumor was, where it was, how it was removed, what's that going to look like down the road when he needs to start, being with his peers and keeping up in the school, in the classroom. Well, he ended up looking like he had a delayed processing. So teachers thought he was purposely choosing to not answer questions, that he wasn't trying hard enough, when indeed his injury, which nobody ever talked about, was that he had a processing, he delayed processing. So a teacher would ask him a question and it would take him, 10 to 20 seconds sometimes to respond. And she's like, we got to come up with a behavior plan for this kid. Well, mom finally found her way to us, thank God. And we got him in for some neuropsych testing with an equivalent of Matt Garlinghouse at Madonna Rehab Hospital. And they were able to do some neuropsych testing to realize this kid, he has delayed processing skills. This is where things are just, those connections are not being made. And then being able to take that back to the school and coming up with a better plan. It's not a behavior plan that you need to punish him because he's not answering questions. No, you as teachers need to do a better job knowing that if you're going to ask him a question, he's going to need more time to answer that. And how, the way in which you instruct him is going to have to look different than the way you maybe instruct others. So that behavior plan was really thrown out the window because they began to realize it's not a won't, it's just simply he can't do things the way other kids could. And again, not any fault of those teachers, they simply didn't know, but why it's important to start to look and question, could it be brain injury? So some screening, the screening that I did with the youth out at the detention center this is by no means a medical evaluation, does not provide a diagnosis. Any of these screening questions, it's not that. But it is starting to just take a look at, is there a likelihood? And could this be why we're seeing some of these problems? So the screening questions, I'm going to go through this with you, but they were asking the screening tools, not just do you have a brain injury, but here's a series of questions. The H stands, the help, we call it the help screen. The H stands for, did you ever have a hit to the head, been choked or strangled? We modified this screen because originally it didn't talk about choked or strangled, but in working with domestic violence, they said you got to add that. So we did. As you can see here, the numbers, the 84% of them were had that hit because of an assault or fight. We also had 48% said from a fall. Keeping in mind, when I'm asking these, kids 14 to 18 years old about these things, it's not give me proof. Do you, it's more of it's a conversation. It's a, do you remember? Do you think this happened? So I do recognize that, you know, their memory of this information may not be super great. With that being said, though, I don't have any reason to believe that they were lying to me. Although you'd almost say, well, they can be pretty manipulative, and that's true, but they had nothing to gain by answering my question, or to gain by not answering my questions best to their knowledge. We did treat them with candy after just by answering questions, but when, even if our numbers are off and we say we had half the kids lie to us, I can tell you statistically they're saying about 8.5% of the general population has maybe had a brain injury. Again, these kids screened 72%. So even if we cut it in half, we're still, our numbers are big. When the other part of the questions for H was, when did this happen? How frequently? And how frequently did it happen? You can see here from our numbers that we had 1 to 3 said this happened, or 44% said that happened to them 1 to 3 times, more than 6 times, 40%. And I can tell you in the work that we're doing with sports concussions, if we have a student athlete have 6 or more concussions, you know, after 2 or 3, we're kind of like, let's be thinking about something else for you to do. And yet these kids, it never even came up in conversation that 6 or more injuries is a concern until we start asking the right set of questions. The E is the emergency room. Did you ever, were you ever seen in the emergency room? This is where 64% of them did not seek medical attention that they could recall. Some of them said, yeah, I remember my mom took me or my dad took me, but the majority of them obviously didn't. The L stands for loss of consciousness. This is, we're really looking for, were you dazed or confused or have a loss of consciousness? 32% of them said, yep, I was knocked out, to the best of their knowledge. 52 of them said, yeah, I felt a little dazed, a little confused, got the dings, saw the stars, all that kind of stuff. Then also, you know, trying to get best we could from them. How long did this happen? How long did you feel that way? And for how many times did you feel that way? The P is really looking at the problems. Did you experience any of these problems afterwards? And we asked them both from, did you have those problems right after the injury, and then are you still experiencing these problems? And as you can see here, kind of from the bottom up, the majority are saying, yep, had problems back then with headaches and dizziness, difficulty concentrating, light sensitivity, fatigue. You know, over half of them were commenting about those symptoms being an issue. When it, you know, currently are you experiencing problems? We still have many of these symptoms are still residing. So this might, one might argue, well, this is your 20% Peg, this is the 20% that are still having problems. And I also recognize that, you know, it gets kind of tricky because some of those kids have mental health diagnosis, you know. So yeah, which is it, the brain injury? Is it the mental health diagnosis? Is it a little bit of both? It's hard to tease out, but I think it's important that we just at least be thinking about, could this be brain injury? And then what are some strategies that we can do to actually be dealing with a head injury versus just assuming that it's mental health? So the diagnosis part, none of these kids, you know, I didn't rush any of these kids, oh, let's get you hooked up with a medical doctor and get it diagnosed. I mean, we know that the reality of the folks that you're serving aren't necessarily going to have access to that, and I get that. But if they were given the opportunity for a diagnosis, you know, where do you go for that? There's assessments and interdisciplinary therapies, there's follow-ups. In my world, in the world of brain injury, from my perspective, this is a really great list of treatment team members. Primary care physician. The second word is not a misspelling. It is indeed the name of it's physiatrist, a doctor of rehabilitation medicine. I have a strong respect for physiatry, especially for folks that have a strong interest in brain injury. And I'm biased because that's what I had the opportunity to work with when I was at Madonna. But physiatrists kind of really work in as a team with the neurologist, the neuropsychologist, the physical therapist, occupational therapist, and speech and language folks to really work collectively as a team to address people's needs. So this is the team that I would say, gosh, those are good people. There are mild brain injury clinics. I know the one that, and again, I don't get paid by Madonna to say this, but Madonna Mild TBI Clinic really does a fine job, both in the Lincoln, the Omaha area. Now, if you're outstate, I know you're probably like, well, who's in my neighborhood? And there's not a lot in your neighborhood that's going to do this comprehensive stuff. So folks will probably need to make the trip. But give us a call if you have further questions about that. Okay, so beyond the hospital, what are some things that you all can do to help make this a little better for folks? Recognizing that sometimes it's a matter of just making those accommodations. You know, we teach teachers let those kids with concussions wear sunglasses inside if the bright lights are bothering them, or put them near a window with natural light. Do what you can to assist them with computer or paperwork. Don't just make assumptions that they got this, because sometimes looking at all those words, it's a little overwhelming, and it's just maybe hard, especially if they're having visual difficulty, being able to process that. So provide help when you can. Learning and memory adjustments, write things down. Don't just make assumptions, they got it. And if you're not one to write things down, all these youth have phones in their hip pocket nowadays. Help them put things into their phones to help them remember things. And don't just assume that they got it and that they're putting it in themselves after they walk out the door, because there's a good chance that they've just already forgotten it. So literally help them put memory, use that phone as a memory aid for them. Do what you can to shorten instructions. Break it down for them. Matt had mentioned already, just really concrete things is important. Modeling task if you can. Checking in for comprehension. Don't just assume that they got it. One time we were working with a young man who had his whole team around him and coming up with some strategies for work. And 30 minutes into it, finally all the professionals stopped talking long enough to go, okay, Todd, you know what you're going to do now? He didn't have a clue. He wasn't able to, they weren't checking in with comprehension on a frequent enough basis. He was like, I don't even know where to start. I'm listening, but it's not retaining the information. So checking in for comprehension is going to be super important. Processing speed and fluency adjustments, changing the way and the rate in which you talk. I know I'm chatting fast, and I know Matt chatted fast, but it's like sometimes processing for folks out with a brain injury is just a little harder. I usually give one example. A lady that we work with, she calls frequently just to let me know what's going on with X, Y, and Z. And so we chat, and she gets all excited and talks really fast. And I find myself matching her rate. And then all of a sudden she kind of stops and she's like, huh? What? And I'm like, oh crap, I'm talking fast again. It's not that she's not hearing me, not that I just need to speak up, because she can still hear me, but she literally can't process the information at the rate I'm going. So I slow down to this uncomfortable pace. It's so hard to talk that slow. But then she starts getting it. And so I just like, oh, she doesn't have to tell me that she's not comprehending. I have to be able to pick up on the huh and the whats. And you might find that to be the case too, now that you know a little bit more about brain injury. Making sure you're giving some cues for sensitive task. So reminders is important. Really creating an environment that's okay for them to ask questions. Acknowledge that they might be having troubles with that. And what can you do to help with it? When it comes to the interpersonal difficulty, again, Matt mentioned, being really direct, skipping the subtleties, trying to not be judgmental, remain calm, and reduce others to do what you can to reduce their agitation, recognizing also that they may not be aware of those deficits. I have this really cool video, but I'm worried that it's going to take too long, so I'm going to skip over it. And if I have a few minutes afterwards, I'm going to come back to it. But a few other tips for staff, just doing what you can to kind of chain appointments together when you can. And again, with the youth that you're working with, you've probably got parents that are kind of helping to be that guide for them. But if you've got youth that you're working with that they have some independence and they need to be making sure they get themselves there on time. Do what you can to put appointments together. See if they need help with a plan for making rides or whatnot. They're not planning for childcare, but doing what you can to kind of help look ahead at what they might be missing, and be that in some ways a parent for them. And keeping in mind that this isn't necessarily, again, it's not a motivational thing. It's sometimes just an ability to do it. And that won't versus can't conversation. Other things, survivor tips, encouraging them. These are some tips that they can do, is to write things down, develop a routine, keep a steady pace, take breaks as needed. A lot of these youth are just needing what we call brain breaks. I think it's one time when someone compared it to like having a small car with a small gas engine. You might need to fill up more frequently than the aircraft carrier that some people drive. It has a big engine, but you can still get around and get things done, but you just need to take breaks. So it might be a 5-minute break. It might be my board member Sharon, who was the principal, she would need brain breaks after her injury, and she had the luxury of being able to put a lawn chair in her closet in her office, and she would just shut herself in there and just not think for like 5 to 10 minutes, and that would give her enough energy to kind of be able to get back into it again. So making sure that kids know that they can take breaks, really encouraging them to not try to multitask, focus on one thing at a time, doing what you can to get them out of non-distracting environments, get plenty of sleep, don't self-medicate. I know in my days at Madonna, as we discharge people, always on the discharge list is avoid alcohol and substance use. Studies are showing that you just get that buzz a lot quicker, and it can really change your abilities. Here's some brain injury resources for you. We here at the Brain Injury Alliance would love to be your resource. We have what we call resource facilitation, which is somebody who could just kind of help you problem solve and case manage some of those folks. We don't take over, but we'll certainly be there to provide some guidance. Some research, if you actually get hooked up with resource facilitation, research in Indiana showed that those with incarceration were much more likely to it had an impact on recidivism if they were hooked up with the right resources, brain injury resources. What can you do now? What, so what? Let us know if we can speak to others that you know. If you're willing to do some brain injury screening, we would love, love, love to get you started on that. And bottom line is, if you're really dealing with these folks and you're like, I don't know what to do, I learned a little bit, in this hour and a half, but I need to know more, just give us a call and we'll help you kind of talk through some of those cases. And that's me. And I talked really fast and I didn't have time for my video. So if there's any questions, happy to take those.
Peggy, there have been a couple of questions. I think one was about screening in general, and then getting your email. So if they wanted to talk to you about maybe how to appropriately screen or what tools might be available, I gave some ideas, but how would they reach you?
Yeah, so on that last slide that I had my contact information, but call me on my cell phone, which is 402-890-0606, or you can send me an email at Peggy, P-E-G-G-Y, at B as in boy, I, A, N as in Nancy, E.org. And the Brain Injury Alliance also, if you just Google Brain Injury Nebraska, you're going to find our website. You can reach out to us that way too. Any other questions? We would certainly love it if people are interested in screening. There's actually, I'm going to put a plug out there. There's a national organization that is offering an opportunity for us to work as a cohort with other states that are also looking at juvenile justice. I am looking for partners that want to help me look at this a little bit more. So if anybody is at all remotely interested, I would love to have a discussion with you about what that looks like and how we can get you involved. I think we can be pioneers here in Nebraska in looking at this, because it's just not talked about nearly enough, even at the national level, and I know definitely not here within the Nebraska level. So if anyone's interested in being a part of a bigger plan, I would love to visit with you. Any other questions? I'm guessing we're losing people because time is up. So.
Oh, they're sticking around. They're sticking around. That's all the questions I think I have. There were questions about, I think many of them had to do with screening, how to manage headaches, and several questions about how to care for, manage folks that have had several concussions, things like that. So I think folks can reach out, and you are a wonderful resource.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you all for taking the time to listen to Matt and I jabber on here and tolerate Matt's silly jokes, dad jokes, but we're good.
Hey, those are awesome. You be careful.
Yeah, I know. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.